think one of the things that I'm sort of left with is we've heard a lot about the vision, right? We've heard a lot about experimentation and innovation. We've also heard about some things that have arrived, right? In moments where the future is now. And I'm curious if you could shed some light on the ground truth. What does smart green mobility really mean in cities today?
Well, and thank you, and I'm a discussant. I'll know better what that is when we're done. But there was a historian, Frederick Turner Jackson, who I guess his whole thesis was that the history of America was a history of the frontier. Go west, young man, just men. And that informed the entire ethic of who we are as Americans. And he was really in vogue for a time. And of course, looking back, he was extraordinarily wrong. The history of America is not the history of the frontier. The history of America is a history of urban areas. It's a history of people leaving the farm, leaving the ranch, and going to be amongst other people in urban settings. One, we're social creatures. Two, we found that it's much more sustainable. You can make a living, you can create more wealth in that environment. And that brings us to where we are today. I think this is a perfect venue for this conversation in the business school because there's a lot of money to be made if you understand or have some idea of what's going to be happening in the next 20 years. When I first started as mayor in 1993, we had, and understand Albuquerque is 623,000 people. It's not that small. If you grow up in this side of Mississippi, you kind of look at the southwest and western cities, you go, those kind of small cities. Well, it's larger than Atlanta, larger than Miami. Mesa, Arizona is larger than Albuquerque, and that's next to Phoenix. So there are major urban areas west of the Mississippi, and we had a number of streets in Albuquerque that big sprawl, wide streets with traffic systems. And I spent a fair amount of my time calling the traffic engineer every morning on my commute to say, hey, how come the synchronized lights aren't working? And if you want to think about it, well, there's an intelligent system. The mayor calls the traffic engineer and asks him, how come the lights aren't properly synchronized? And of course the response is, well, they were synchronized last week. Somehow they came unsynchronized. And it's not a smart system. I still don't quite know what a smart city is. I'm sure there's an entire course that we taught around what actually constitutes a smart city. But the fact of the matter is, there are dramatic changes afoot. When I first heard of autonomous automobiles about a year ago, came in my radar, what cute. That's a cute little notion. But if you start talking to the folks at Ford, at Google, they are very, very serious about it. This is going to happen. It's going to happen just on time for when you have to have that conversation with your parents, grandparents about taking the keys away. I think it's going to be some form of salvation, which will have some more unintended consequences when you have a lot of folks who really can't see, can't hear, but they're all around and still incredibly mobile. So the idea is to appreciate what's coming on and understand I'm a recovering attorney, so I can be much more flexible with my facts than either the gentleman to my left. I thought, Doctor, your conversation about unintended consequences and also what really are the savings that happen. Because with each new technology, there's something else that we find out. We know that the majority of carbon emission, at least in this country, and I think globally, not from cars, it's from buildings. The construction of buildings, the utilization of buildings, and you can build the smartest building in the world, but if we don't use it properly, the human element, well, its efficiency is substantially degraded. And then after that comes how we get around, how we are mobile as a community. Boston was not premised on the automobile. It was, horse and carriage. I think they carried. I know at least it was the horse. And the cities west of the Mississippi, particularly the southwestern and western cities, were entirely constructed based on the automobile. And I'll give you Albuquerque, which has a horrible sprawl challenge, with Phoenix, all the cities in the West do. But if you are building a city in an era of inexhaustible land, cheap fuel, sprawl makes sense. It just makes sense. It no longer makes sense. in the economy that we're in. And so policymakers in cities like Boston, we won't talk about the Big Dig and how that worked, but or has worked, but policymakers in the older cities have much more opportunities and the lower challenges, I would say, to mobility, because you could build it in. Telling somebody in Albuquerque that you need a streetcar, for example, that's a big challenge. Once they're in, people take it for granted, and it works. So I wanted to raise this with the professor and the doctor. Had a conversation not long ago with Greg Ballard, who just left office in Indianapolis. Very, very thoughtful mayor. And we were talking about public transportation. Mayors talk about public transportation a lot. And he said, Marty, I want to talk about my city in a post-public transportation era. I didn't really know what he meant. I'm not sure exactly still what he meant, but it was thought-provoking. And we know that, at least I think, any mayor in any major city in America that doesn't have a task force right now looking at the impact of autonomous automobiles on the planning process, the cities will look dramatically different. When no one's driving, when they're just occupying, is probably missing something very important. So what is a post-public transit city? Can I ask that, or is that your?
Yeah, no, you can ask that, absolutely. You can feel free to pose questions for another too.
Well, I think
You may not know what I
No,
was.
no, I don't know. I don't know. It's not what he was thinking about, but certainly the whole idea of moving from vehicles that are owned by individuals to vehicles that are owned by third parties, maintained by it opens up all. It takes out the idea of mass transit packers on the bus for everyone. So you can have all these alternatives, which one include if you're willing to pay for it. You decide that this Canberra thing, basically implementing things we already get on Uber and Lyft and other. If you want to ride with 3 other people, you could choose that option, or I by yourself and choose that option. So you can basically dial in your trip home from point to point on what you want to take. And I think that that's sort of the camel's nose of where things should go. The interesting thing about all this is you don't park at all. You don't have any, these vehicles are constantly moving around the lot, which is great for congestion. As I said, the real challenge we don't here is the end of what's really the energy and environmental consequences, which could go into it. But I think that also the design space for really every choice of implement vehicle ownership, control. I think that's what it's.
So I can offer a concept which I cannot take credit for. I have to attribute it to actually somebody from the University of Michigan who's in urban planning. And
Painful as though it's
no, it's a great guy. So his thesis is that it's not about mobility. It's about access. You don't drive your car because you enjoy driving around. I'm sure there are people that own Lamborghinis and Ferraris, Jeeps, yes. But basically you want to go someplace. So it's not about mobility, but about access. So if you look at public transportation, I think that's probably where you have to start and say, why are people taking the bus? Because they want to end up going to work or going to the movies or going to the supermarket. And if you start from that point of view, that's about access and not about mobility, then a lot of the points that you raise about parking and about, why should I even own a car which is used at least 3% of the time, that sounds about right, then maybe you can start the thinking process, which is a little different. But what the solution is, I don't know.
And I guess the one thing that is interesting is that people who don't have mobility right now because they're too old or they're physically disabled, their option is to take a cab, which is really too expensive. If you take the driver out of the cab, that changes this equation in a way. It also drives up energy. But so this idea of excess, I think, is exactly right. But the dilemma is you have a lot of low-income people who are now forced out of the city, moving out and services. How is this going to serve them? I'm not sure.
Mayor, I'd love to, we are in the business school, but still we like to, the Initiative on Cities always likes to sort of inject that dose of reality into conversation from the perspective of a politician. Thinking about the sort of some of the political barriers, you know, I always imagine, I think I now believe that the most active decentralized advocacy group in Boston is car owners. Because if there's ever a debate about parking, if there's a new development going up, they show up in droves. I mean, it's not about race, it's not about education, it's about cars in the city. And I'm really curious when we think about transportation future and the future of mobility in cities, can you shed a little bit of light on some of the political realities and political hurdles that you faced, or that mayors generally face when they're trying to tackle some of these issues?
Well, I can tell you one story, and I'm pleased that I've won more elections than I've lost. But I lost one, very probably due to red light cameras. Do we have them out here? Red light cameras? Got them in the DC area where I'm at now. And, you know, they'll take your picture. I loved them. I brought them in because we had a horrible problem with red light camera, you know, people running red lights, and tremendous accidents. The result. I like them because I can catch my police officers speeding. Police officers never get tickets, but it's a camera. It's unavoidable. And we added on a speeding component. So you also got a fine if you went over 10 miles an hour over the speed limit. If it was over 10 miles an hour over, we ended up tapping, I don't know how many Albuquerqueans, $100 a pop. Boom, boom, boom. At some point, you take $100 out of everybody's pocket, you get upset. And whether they're right or wrong. And in fact, we had a referendum. People voted them down, voted me out. And so you have to be careful about your politics and transportation. And explaining that running a rail system or enhancing a bus rapid transit system is more cost effective than building a new overpass is a difficult one. If you're explaining to somebody who's sitting, you know, in traffic in the morning just trying to get to work and doesn't believe that mass transit really fits their lifestyle. So, you know, this politics are thick in transportation.
And this is a question for all of you, whose job is this? You know, we talked about, Chris just made the great point of there's massive amounts of data. You know, Henry, you spoke about the data that the city of Ann Arbor is sitting on from its traffic cameras. And I'm really wondering, are there, to really bring about transformational change, are there new models that are needed? Are there new partnerships? Are there new financing tools that aren't at the disposal of city today? Is this supposed to be the federal government's job? Is it universities? Is it the cities themselves to take a lot of the data and turn it into actionable knowledge? Or do we need models that just don't even exist? Is it the private sector? I mean, do we need models that just don't even exist yet?
Well, the answer is yes, we need models that don't exist yet. I think if I were to pick a level of government, it would be the mayors. And one thing that is really important is to get some kind of uniformity across the country here, because you don't want to have an API in your car that works in Boston but dies in Albuquerque. And we haven't talked about this interoperability problem, but it's a real problem to get a bunch of different balkanized systems. And we've had this trouble with even stupid things like automatic easy passes and so on. But this is going to be that problem on steroid. And you have a bunch of competing proprietaries. This is, by the way, the same problem in automated buildings where you have everybody trying to invent their own standard. But this is a thing where I think government just needs to step in and say, look, this is a public safety issue. I would hope, I think the Fed can provide money to the extent that they have any money left. But I think the leadership, to me, it does come on the mayors. And I hope working with the university research team to help. It's a really thorny problem. Dilemma is the private sector, in many cases, is way ahead of what the cities are doing. You know, the universities, I think, can be beyond the program.
Yeah, my gut feeling is that universities have a major role to play here. In some ways, my experience in Boston is that We have sometimes been sitting as arbitrators or as go-betweens between the private sector, which is trying to cram down the throats of mayors or departments in cities their solutions, and the cities which want to do the right thing, but they don't know what's really right. So a university can sit in the middle and take a proposed solution and test it and see does it fit the city, or take problems from the city and look at what's available out there as the private sector and say, I think this solution is better than another. Having said that, that's not what a university is supposed to be doing. Okay, I mean, we're supposed to teach, we're supposed to research, we're supposed to do other things. But it seems that we are now being put in a position that we can play this role. And we have ways of doing that. We call them centers or institutes and so on. And an institute, for instance, is the right way to bring together a lot of experts with relatively stable funding, so you don't have the worry about how do I support my student next semester and so on. But of course, as you say, I think we need new models, and this has been very frustrating to myself and others, because we have all these great ideas, but who is going to fund them? Federal government, like the National Science Foundation, for instance, doesn't really have the incentive to do that beyond perhaps some generic technologies that affect smart cities. The cities are not built that way. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's a research department in most cities that say, well, we have so many millions of dollars every year to give out for research grants. And the companies, on the other hand, they don't really have an incentive either to sort of fund these big research projects because of the data problem mostly. The data is shared by the cities. The companies, they want to use the data by themselves. They're very defensive about that, understandably so. So I am puzzled about what the right formula is to move to this form of research, which is good for the public, good for all of us. But nobody seems to have found the right way to do it.
I personally think that science and technology hold the answers to almost all of these challenges. And you've seen in some of the debates recently, the presidential debates, some candidates on climate change go, well, I'm not a scientist, so I can't really give you an opinion on climate change. And others go, well, I'm not a scientist either, but I can talk to one. And I can be informed by that. And in fact, that's going to be necessary. No matter what scientists conclude or experts in technologies conclude, it's still got to be filtered through a political process, because the power is actually vested in elected officials. If you look at China, I call China capitalism unfettered by democracy. But we have democracy, and it's good to be fettered by democracy, I would contend. There's a huge dysfunction in this country, and it's the Constitution of the United States. Boy, that's on film. But I say this, and we were talking about this earlier, cities and counties are not to be found in the Constitution. They're just not there. It's the federal government. There are 50 states, and any economist will tell you, if you want to properly understand the way the economy works in this country, it's metroeconomics. Money doesn't necessarily respect the barriers that cities have erected, or counties. Money washes back and forth. And Washington doesn't think that way. Congresspersons, senators divide by 50. And that's all there is to it. And it's a big disconnect between what's real and what the political process is. So I don't think anybody's going to solve this problem in 50 states. That sounds like a mayor talking. The governors will probably have to disagree on that. But it's a challenge and a barrier.
So we've got about 10 minutes left, so I want to open it up for questions so we get a chance to get to them.
My name is Wissam. I'm from Palestine, and I'm a visiting scholar at MIT. My question is for Prof. Grace. I'm just curious to know whether the system you built, is it possible to integrate sensors to monitor air pollution, pollutants from traffic, to see the trends when you change the patterns of traffic control, which will have more implication on the health aspects of the public?
Yes, the answer is yes. There's a colleague of mine who is not here. She's actually on sabbatical, and she does exactly that. Interestingly, her work and mine use the same data. It's the same data. What are the traffic flows, the volumes, the counts. but she runs this data through some physics-based models, which translate the traffic volumes and the patterns into pollution. And I use the same data and translate it into things like congestion and fuel consumption, but we basically do the same thing. And she has written, published papers in which she analyzes, for instance, what would happen if you improve certain traffic conditions, how much of a reduction you can gain in emissions, and so on. My understanding is, and I'm not an expert in this, that there's enough physical modeling going on, physics modeling going on to permit that. So given the right data, we can do that.
Clifford Cleveland, Department of Earth and Environment here at BU. Thanks for this stimulating discussion. So I would respectfully, your observations about, real life as a politician are, I think, to me, go to the root of the issue. And I actually respectfully disagree that the challenges are science and engineering. If we give Chris and all the Chris's in the world sufficient money, they'll figure we'll have endless choices. To me, it's ultimately the individual versus the social optimum, right? The individual in the United States who wants to, do what they want to do versus the social optimum. And how do we decide, which, the individual choosing has given us the mess that we have now largely, enabled by land use planning and other things, where people can now, along with cheap energy, live 30 or 40 or 50 miles away and get in a single passenger automobile and drive to work. And that has created these enormous externalities, social, environmental, and so on. Yet trying to impose, a social optimum by some enlightened central planners or scientists or whatever is hugely problematic. And it's getting worse in this country, trying to do that, as we see in the current election. So how do we, deal with, having this wide array of technical and scientific solutions, which I believe can be generated if we support them, we probably aren't enough, in this country, this inherent conflict we have of individualism versus a social optimum.
I think this is for you.
No, you're not off the hook.
It's why
You're being asked by the public.
I would suggest that I think people want to do the right thing. I really do. And you have to make doing the right thing possible for them. Recycling is a pretty simple issue. And you can debate what the impact of recycling is for bridge recycling on our emissions, but we know it's a good thing. But 15 years ago, there weren't recycling bins. So if you made them responsible for having to separate everything out and then take it down to it just wasn't working. But if you make it possible for them to do it, easy to do, they'll do the right thing. You get bins out there, that makes my job as a consumer and a citizen much more simple. And even with electric vehicles, which I'm a big believer in, if there's no recharging stations, they're just not, it doesn't work. So if scientists and the institutes do the right thing, the elected officials listen, and even more importantly, constituents demand those things of their elected officials. It means you have to have an informed electorate. The change will occur.
I actually agree with you about the individual versus the social optimum. I would argue that it's happening, I sort of agree with you too, little by little. And in some cases, actually, we are treated and behave like sheep. I'll give an example. When you travel by air, have you thought about what's happening from the minute you're at the gate until you go to the other side of God? You're totally at the mercy of whoever has decided how they're going to board, how are they going to queue you up, if they do it by rear first, front, or by aisle first, or window first, how they're going to do it. You're totally at their mercy, and you do it, and you don't really complain. Somebody has, you can complain, and I complain too, but you just do it. So somehow somebody has created that mentality, and it happens. So if you build that thing, the credibility factor, and you convince people, policymakers eventually will make changes. Of course, having said that, I have a lot of colleagues at the DOT, the Volpe Center, which is the DOT center we have in Cambridge, who every time I see them for the past 10 years, always tell me how we have all this wonderful technology, magnetic levitation and so on, for trains, and we cannot deploy fast, efficient trains in the United States because, the airline lobby is so strong. So, I can argue both ways. But the fact is that there are examples of where we're just the sheep that behave according to whoever has decided the social optimum is. In that case, the airline, how to, load us and unload us from planes.
Other questions?
My name is Phil Warburg. I was the head of a group called the Conservation Law Foundation, and part of its task during the 1990s was to make sure that, as part and parcel of the Big Dig, public transit was not forgotten about. These engineers were delighted to design every aspect of the tunneling system for cars and didn't really want to focus on what was happening with public transit. And I have to say, listening to the two presentations today, the overwhelming focus was on how are we going to automate our automobile fleets. And what concerns me gravely about that is that it's a neat technological challenge. Obviously, the automotive corporations are thrilled to have America engage because they want to be allowed the automobile in an era where we might be thinking about alternatives. And I'm very concerned from an energy standpoint, among other things, about the data management burden, many other aspects as well, of having an entire nation or an entire world driving around in, or not being driven around in automated vehicles. And I'm just curious as to how you see public transit fit into this puzzle.
Well, I think he was asking about what is beyond mass transit. What you want to do is provide access to everybody that's safe, environmentally sustainable, and economically efficient. We've got a whole bunch of new alternatives. Right now, I think that with automation could get around the toughest problems of mass transit and get a much, much higher fraction of people in more efficient vehicles just by rationalizing the system. I mean, right now, you have the ability to have mass transit pick you up. Are we about to be bounced out of the room?
We are going to actually bounce out of the room,
Oh,
and
so
I think it's a terrific question.
Nothing like
I know. Well, it sounds as though there is a class that is waiting to fill the seats. And to learn, yes. Pay good money to do it. No, so I just wanted to say, round of applause for our speakers.